November 17, 1941. The Libyan desert. 55 men fall through darkness into a nightmare. Winds hit 35 miles per hour. Lightning makes compasses spin. Parachutes drag men across razor-sharp rocks faster than they can unclip. Some are scraped to death. Others drown in flash floods. Tortoises swimming past their bodies. By dawn, only 21 men will answer roll call. 0 aircraft destroyed. The Special Air Service, Britain's newest elite unit, has just failed catastrophically on its very first mission. But somewhere in that same desert, a line of Chevrolet trucks is already heading toward the extraction point. The men driving those trucks have no idea they are about to rescue not just survivors, but an entire legend from extinction. This is the story of the Long-Range Desert Group, the forgotten unit that made the SAS possible. If this story interests you, consider subscribing. There are more untold moments from the war waiting beneath the surface. To understand why those trucks mattered, we must go back 17 months, to a modest attic office in Cairo, and a meeting that would change the nature of special operations forever. June 1940. France had fallen in 6 weeks. The British Expeditionary Force had barely escaped at Dunkirk, abandoning nearly all its heavy equipment on the beaches. Italy had just declared war, sensing easy pickings from a wounded empire. And in North Africa, Marshal Rodolfo Graziani commanded 15 Italian divisions, 250,000 men, poised to sweep into Egypt. The British had fewer than 36,000 troops to stop them. Outnumbered nearly 10-1, with Rommel's Africa Corps soon to arrive, the British position looked hopeless. The desert itself presented a different kind of problem. Between the Italian forces and Egypt lay something the British Army considered impassable: the Libyan Sand Sea. Dunes rose 300 feet high. Temperatures soared past 130 degrees Fahrenheit in summer and dropped below freezing at night. The most up-to-date British map of Libya dated from 1915. The interior was marked with phrases like "limit of sand dunes unknown." Military planners assumed the desert protected their southern flank. No army could cross it, no vehicle could survive it, no navigation system could chart it. They were almost right. No army could cross it, but one man already had. Major Ralph Alger Bagnold was not a typical soldier. Born in 1896 to a military family, his father had participated in the Gordon Rescue Expedition to Khartoum. He had served 3 years in the trenches of the First World War before studying engineering at Cambridge. But it was what he did between the wars that made him unique. Between 1929 and 1932, Bagnold led expeditions covering over 10,000 miles of uncharted Libyan desert in modified Ford trucks. His 1930 expedition made the first east-to-west crossing of the Libyan desert, 6,000 miles through terrain no European had ever traversed. He climbed dunes that swallowed vehicles whole. He navigated by the stars when sandstorms erased the horizon. He watched men hallucinate from heat and thirst, and learned how to keep them alive anyway. The challenges seemed impossible until he solved them one by one. Standard compasses were useless. The magnetic variations across the desert made them unreliable, and vehicle metal threw them off completely. So Bagnold invented the sun compass, a deceptively simple device, a horizontal disc with a vertical needle casting a shadow, adjustable for the sun's position throughout the day. It could be read accurately while bouncing over rough terrain at speed. The British Army refused to adopt it. The Egyptian Army did. Water was another impossibility. Radiators boiled constantly in the heat, and conventional vehicles consumed water faster than they could carry it. Bagnold developed condensers that captured and recycled the steam, dramatically extending range. He calculated fuel consumption across different terrain types and mapped routes accordingly. He learned which sand would support a vehicle and which would swallow it. His scientific work on sand physics, published in The Physics of Blown Sand and Desert Dunes in 1941, remains a foundational text. NASA later used it to design Mars landing probes. The Bagnold dunes on Mars are named in his honor. When war came, Bagnold submitted proposals for a deep desert reconnaissance force. Twice. Both were rejected. Cairo headquarters considered the idea somewhere between ridiculous and madness. One staff officer warned him bluntly, "You will get lost." The real problem was ignorance breeding fear. The generals could not imagine what Bagnold had already done. Then Italy declared war on June 10, 1940. Suddenly, the impossible became necessary. Bagnold tried a third time, enlisting a friend to place the proposal directly on General Wavell's desk. On June 23, 1940, he stood before General Sir Archibald Wavell in that modest attic office. The general's face was weathered and lined, one eye covered by a patch from a wound suffered in the First World War. He had a reputation for unconventional thinking and for recognizing talent that others dismissed. Bagnold explained his plan: cross the impassable Sand Sea, establish observation posts behind Italian lines, and read enemy traffic along desert routes. Wavell listened without interruption. Then he asked a question that would echo through military history. What would you do if you found no enemy activity? Bagnold's answer came without hesitation. How about some piracy on the high desert? For an instant, Bagnold feared he had gone too far. The room fell silent, but Wavell's face changed. The wrinkled features creased into a broad grin. The eye grew very bright indeed. One observer noted that the whole head could have belonged to a pirate captain. Wavell gave him 6 weeks. Bagnold was ready in 5. What happened next was unprecedented in military bureaucracy. Wavell dictated an order marked most secret to all heads of branches and directorates. I wish any demand made personally by Major Bagnold to be met urgently and without question. This absolute carte blanche allowed Bagnold to bypass every bureaucratic obstacle. When he drew machine guns, only 3 Vickers guns remained as total reserve for the entire Middle East. When he drew radios, the last number 11 radio set in the Middle East War Reserve went to his 3rd patrol. Think about that. The British Army was so desperate, so stretched thin, that Bagnold was taking their last reserves, and he was using them for a mission most officers considered suicide. Bagnold deliberately rejected what he called death or glory daredevils and regular troops. No time to unlearn such men of their routine ways. Instead, he recruited 80 New Zealand sheep farmers. He described them as tougher and more weather-beaten in looks than their British counterparts. Shrewd, dry-humored, curious of every new thing, men who could fix an engine in the middle of nowhere, men who understood that survival in hostile terrain required patience, not bravado, men who had grown up navigating vast, featureless landscapes by instinct and observation. By September 1940, the long-range desert group was operational. Their first full patrol covered 4,000 miles undetected behind Italian lines. Over the next 28 months, LRDG patrols would be behind enemy lines, missing only 15 days total, operating across an area the size of India with never more than 350 men. But this story is not just about the LRDG. It is about what happened when their paths crossed with a young Scottish officer whose ambition had just collided with disaster. Lieutenant David Stirling was 6 feet 5 inches tall, the son of a Scottish brigadier, and utterly convinced he had found a better way to fight the war. He was languid, charming, and possessed of what one acquaintance called lazy brilliance, capable of extraordinary bursts of energy followed by long periods of apparent inactivity. He had climbed mountains. He had gambled away fortunes. He had drifted through his 20s without finding his purpose. The war gave him that purpose. In the summer of 1941, he proposed a radical idea. Small teams of highly trained men, inserted behind enemy lines by parachute, could destroy more aircraft on the ground than the entire Royal Air Force could shoot down in the air. Every fighter pilot knew that parked aircraft were vulnerable, but no one had systematically attacked them. Stirling intended to change that. Audacious, unconventional, and nearly impossible to sell, Stirling had been injured in a parachute accident. He could barely walk, so he obtained crutches, bluffed his way past the guards at Middle East headquarters, and presented his plan directly to the Deputy Chief of Staff. The brass were impressed enough to give him a chance. They gave him permission to form L Detachment Special Air Service Brigade, a unit that existed only on paper, designed to fool German intelligence into thinking a much larger airborne force was operating in North Africa. The deception would outlast the war. The name would become legend. Among Stirling's first recruits was Robert Blair Mayne, known to everyone as Paddy. An Irish solicitor by profession, Mayne had represented Ireland in rugby and boxed at the amateur level. He stood 6 feet 2 inches with wrists twice the size of those of a normal man. But it was not his size that made him dangerous. It was something behind his eyes. Mike Sadler, a navigator who knew Mayne well, would later observe, Paddy felt his true vocation in war. He was well suited to war and he enjoyed it. Others described him as frighteningly calm under fire, capable of acts of violence that would have shattered most men. He had been transferred to Lay Force Commandos after allegedly striking a superior officer. Where other soldiers saw combat as necessary horror, Mayne saw clarity. By November 1941, Stirling had 55 men ready for their first operation. They called it Operation Squatter. 5 Bristol Bombay aircraft would drop them onto Gazala and Timimi airfields in Libya, timed to support the 8th Army's Operation Crusader offensive. They would destroy German aircraft on the ground, then escape overland to a rendezvous point where LRDG trucks would extract them. It was a good plan. The weather destroyed it. The night of November 16, 1941, one of the worst storms to hit the North African desert in 30 years, struck with almost malevolent timing. Winds reached 30 knots, 35 miles per hour. Lightning made compasses spin uselessly. Thunder rolled across the desert like artillery. On the ground, men would later report wading through knee-deep water, with tortoises swimming around them. Flash floods carved new channels through terrain that had been bone dry for months. Inside the aircraft, the men men felt every gust. The Bristol Bombays bucked and shuddered. Men who had trained for months, who had jumped from aircraft dozens of times, found themselves gripping their seats with white knuckles. Some prayed, others stared straight ahead, faces blank, trying not to think about what waited below. Brigadier General Galloway recommended aborting the mission. Sterling refused. They had trained for months. The offensive was launching. Their targets were waiting. They would jump. Jeff Duvivier was one of the men who went out the door that night. His diary, written afterward, captures the chaos. When I finally freed myself, I was bruised and bleeding, and there was a sharp pain in my right leg. When I saw the rocky ground I had traveled over, I thanked my lucky stars that I was alive. The wind had dragged him across the desert floor like a rag doll, his parachute refusing to collapse, rocks tearing at his equipment and flesh. Johnny Cooper, another survivor, remembered the descent. The wind when you jumped was ferocious, and of course you could not see the ground coming up. I hit the desert with quite a bump, and was then dragged along by the wind at quite a speed. In the darkness, with rain lashing sideways and lightning strobing across the sky, men could not tell up from down. High winds scattered parachutists miles off course. Drop zones that should have been minutes apart became hours of stumbling through flooded wadis. One aircraft was shot down by a German Messerschmitt. The crew and passengers never found. Men were dragged across rocky terrain by parachutes they could not unclip. The release mechanisms jammed by rain and sand. Some were literally scraped to death. Their bodies found the next morning with no skin remaining on their backs. Most could not find their equipment containers in the darkness. Rain soaked all their fuses, rendering explosives useless. The carefully designed Lewis bombs reduced to waterlogged lumps of plastic explosive. One man, Sergeant John Cheney, was never found. His fate remains unknown to this day. The final count was devastating. Of 55 men who jumped, only 21 returned. A casualty rate of 67%. Not a single enemy aircraft destroyed. Not one bomb placed. Not one mission objective achieved. Think about that contrast. The SAS had promised to destroy enemy aircraft more efficiently than conventional forces. On their first mission, they lost 2/3 of their men without touching a single target. By any reasonable measure, the unit should have been disbanded immediately. Sterling himself should have been court-martialed for refusing to abort. The whole concept of small unit airborne raids should have been written off as romantic foolishness. But someone was already driving toward the survivors. The LRDG had been designated to extract whatever was left of the SAS. On November 20th and 21st, LRDG patrols rolled through the desert toward the predetermined rendezvous points. Their Chevrolet trucks, loaded with fuel and water, navigated by sun compass across terrain that would have swallowed a conventional column. The storm had passed, leaving the desert scrubbed clean and eerily silent. They found broken men scattered across miles of hostile terrain, some wounded, limping toward the rendezvous with improvised splints, some in shock, barely able to speak, all demoralized. The men who had trained to be elite raiders looked like refugees from a disaster, which, in a sense, they were. By November 25th, what remained of L Detachment had reached Jagbub Oasis. They ate hot food for the first time in days. They cleaned wounds that had festered in the rain, and they began to talk about what had gone wrong. A 1943 classified report would later conclude, found inadvisable to carry out any more parachute operations in Western Desert. Long-range operations proved much more successful, but the real turning point came from a simple question. The LRDG officers looked at Sterling's shattered unit and asked, "Why are you parachuting in? We can drive you." On November 28, 1941, LRDG Commander Lieutenant Colonel Guy Prendergast sent a signal that would change the war, as LRDG, not trained for demolitions, suggest parachutists used for blowing. The partnership was formalized in that dry military language. LRDG would provide transport, navigation, and extraction. SAS would provide the explosive expertise. Each unit would do what it did best. The men who had just failed so catastrophically were about to get a second chance, and this time they would have the Desert Masters showing them the way. December 14th, 1941, less than a month after the parachute disaster. Operating from Jalo Oasis, the first LRDG transported SAS raids launched into the Libyan night. The LRDG trucks had driven them over 300 miles behind enemy lines, through terrain the Germans considered impassable. The journey took days. They slept during the hottest hours, drove at night when the temperatures dropped and the dust settled. They passed within sight of enemy positions, relying on the desert's immensity to swallow them. If a vehicle broke down, they fixed it. If they encountered soft sand, they laid sand channels and drove across. If they got lost, though they rarely did, they waited for the stars and recalculated. Now the SAS team separated to hit multiple airfields simultaneously. The LRDG drivers would wait 3 miles from each target, engines running, ready for immediate extraction. Paddy Mayne led his team toward Tamat Airfield. What happened next became legend. They crept through the darkness toward rows of parked aircraft. The desert cold bit through their uniforms. Their breath misted in the air. Every sound seemed amplified. The crunch of sand underfoot, the distant rumble of generators, the clink of metal against metal, as they prepared their bombs. Maine moved like a shadow, his massive frame somehow silent, placing Lewis bombs, specially designed, time-delayed explosives, on aircraft after aircraft, 24 planes. But Maine was not finished. Light spilled from a building nearby. The officer's mess. What Maine did next was recorded in his own words. I kicked open the door and stood there with my Colt 45, the others at my side with a Tommy gun and another automatic. The Germans stared at us. We were a peculiar and frightening sight, bearded and with unkempt hair. For what seemed like an age, we just stood there looking at each other in complete silence. I said, "Good evening." At that, a young German arose and moved slowly backwards. I shot him. In the chaos that followed, Maine and his team killed approximately 30 German and Italian aircrew, destroyed fuel and ammunition dumps, and walked calmly back to where the LRDG trucks waited, engines running. Behind them, the first Lewis bombs detonated, then another, then another. The sky turned orange as aircraft fuel ignited. 24 aircraft destroyed. The same SAS that had lost 67% of its men without touching a single target had just eliminated an entire squadron. Maine personally accounted for more enemy aircraft in one night than most fighter pilots destroyed in their entire careers. Meanwhile, Bill Fraser's 5-man team struck Agadir airfield, claiming 37 aircraft destroyed. Jock Lewis, inventor of the Lewis bomb itself, reached Akela, but found no aircraft present. David Sterling himself reached Sirte, but stepped on a sleeping Italian sentry in the darkness, triggering the alarm. 0 aircraft for Sterling that night. The irony was not lost on him. Total for the December 14th raid: approximately 61 aircraft destroyed. SAS casualties, 0. The contrast could not have been more stark. Same men, same objective, same determination, different method. The only thing that changed was how they got there. 10 days later, on Christmas Eve 1941, Maine went back to Tammet. The Germans had restocked it with replacement aircraft, thinking surely the raiders would not return to the same target. They did not understand who they were dealing with. Maine destroyed 27 more. By mid-1942, SAS and LRDG operations had destroyed over 250 aircraft. By January 1943, when Sterling was finally captured, the combined total exceeded 400 aircraft destroyed on the ground, more than many entire fighter squadrons shot down during the entire war, all because a few trucks knew how to cross the impossible desert. The German reaction revealed just how effective the partnership had become. Bagnold himself wrote, "To the Italians, the raiders seemed to appear from nowhere, as if from a fourth dimension, and to disappear as rapidly. The enemy simply could not comprehend how British soldiers were materializing hundreds of miles behind their lines. They assumed the attacks must be coming from the sea, submarines perhaps, or hidden coastal bases. The desert was impassable. Everyone knew that. One LRDG account from Frank Harrison captures the audacity. We drove through a huge German army camp. The cooks were just getting up, odd fellows walking about, going to the lavatories and having a wash. We just drove through them waving. They waved back. Why not? 5 trucks driving through your camp in the early morning, waving to you. Why not wave back? Cannot possibly be enemy all that way behind German lines. Impossible. But the highest validation came from the enemy's greatest commander. Field Marshal Rommel, writing to his wife in February 1943, made an assessment that would echo through military history. The Desert Group, which has caused us more damage than any other British unit of equal strength. Think about that. Rommel, the Desert Fox himself, arguably the finest tactical commander of the war, singled out this partnership as uniquely devastating. Not the 8th Army with its hundreds of thousands of men, not the Royal Air Force with its squadrons of fighters and bombers. A few hundred men in trucks, navigating by sun compass and determination. When Sterling was finally captured in January 1943, Rommel's diary revealed both respect and relief. He noted that Sterling had escaped from initial custody and tried to bribe local Arabs to guide him back to British lines. But his bid must have been too small for the Arabs, with their usual eye to business, offered him to us for 11 pounds of tea, a bargain which we soon clinched. Thus the British lost the very able and adaptable commander of the Desert Group, which had caused us more damage than any other British unit of equal strength. Rommel nicknamed Sterling the Phantom Major. A bounty of 100,000 Reichsmarks was placed on his head. Notably, Rommel was reportedly the only German commander to ignore Hitler's infamous commando order, which demanded execution of captured special forces, demonstrating his professional respect for these soldiers. Even enemies, it seemed, recognized something remarkable. Hitler himself was described as apoplectic at the SAS's success. He ordered the training of a 500-strong German paratrooper force specifically to hunt the SAS. The Germans even formed their own LRDG equivalent, led by Count Laszlo Almasi, ironically, one of Bagnold's pre-war desert exploration colleagues. The teacher's methods were now being studied by the enemy. The partnership between the LRDG and SAS lasted until the Desert War ended, but the LRDG's contribution extended far beyond taxi service, a nickname that would inadvertently diminish their reputation for decades. Consider their road watch operation from March 2nd to July 21st, 1942. From a concealed position, 350 yards from the Via Balbia, the main Axis supply road, LRDG patrols conducted continuous observation of Rommel's traffic. They lay motionless for hours in the brutal heat, counting trucks, noting tank types, logging convoy compositions. Every vehicle was recorded and reported. Middle East intelligence considered this the single most important LRDG contribution of the war, confirming enemy strength before critical battles. Casualties during the entire operation, 0. Or consider this, during the entire desert campaign, 28 months of continuous operations, LRDG patrols were behind enemy lines, missing only 15 days. They operated across an area of over 1 million square miles, with never more than 350 men. Their casualty rate in the desert was remarkably low, 16 killed, 24 captured. The men who drove into the impossible returned again and again because they knew the desert better than anyone alive. Field Marshal Montgomery himself acknowledged their value before the critical Battle of Mareth Line. But for the LRDG's probing of the Mareth Line in Tunisia, his attack would have been a leap in the dark. And David Sterling, speaking at the opening of refurbished SAS barracks in 1984, finally gave them their due. In those early days, we came to owe the long-range desert group a deep debt of gratitude. The LRDG were the supreme professionals of the desert, and they were unstinting in their help. The supreme professionals, not taxi drivers, not support staff. The men who knew the impossible terrain, who had mastered navigation by sun compass when everyone else relied on maps that were 30 years out of date, who could drive 1,000 miles behind enemy lines and arrive exactly where they said they would, exactly when they said they would. The LRDG was disbanded in August 1945. Unlike the SAS, which was reconstituted after the war and went on to become the most famous special forces unit in the world, the long-range desert group was never reformed. When the SAS made world headlines during the Iranian embassy siege in 1980, they had decades of continued operations behind them. The LRDG had only their wartime achievements, and that unfortunate nickname. Ralph Bagnold retired as a brigadier on June 7, 1944. He continued his desert research, became a Fellow of the Royal Society, and was keynote speaker at a 1978 NASA conference on planetary surface processes. His work directly informed the design of Mars rovers. He died on May 28, 1990. Age 94. The Bagnold Dunes on Mars remain his cosmic memorial, a fitting tribute for a man who had mastered one impossible landscape and helped humanity understand another. A memorial plaque was placed in Westminster Abbey's West Cloister on December 9, 2013, positioned below the SAS memorial. It shows tracks across a desert landscape, rendered in reddish sand-colored stone. A modest tribute, perhaps. But then, the LRDG had always preferred to operate in the shadows. But perhaps the truest memorial is this. Every time the SAS is mentioned, every time their founding legend is told, the story begins with that disastrous November parachute drop. 67% casualties, 0 aircraft destroyed, a failure that should have ended everything. What the legend rarely mentions is who picked up the survivors, who asked the obvious question, why are you parachuting in? Who drove them 300 miles behind enemy lines so they could try again? Who showed them that the impossible was merely difficult if you knew the way? November 17, 1941. 21 men walk out of the desert, broken and defeated. The SAS should have died that night. It did not die because somewhere in that darkness, Chevrolet trucks were already heading toward them. Because a former desert explorer had seen what generals could not, that the impassable Sand Sea was simply another road if you knew how to read it. Because 80 New Zealand sheep farmers had learned to navigate by sun compass and survive where armies could not follow. The SAS became legend, the LRDG became a footnote, but every legend needs someone to carry it out of the darkness. That is what the long-range desert group did, not just once, but again and again, across an area the size of India, for 28 months. With never more than 350 men. They did not merely make the SAS possible, they rescued it from extinction, showed it how to fight, drove it to every target, and then stepped back into the shadows while others claimed the glory. That is why Rommel, the Desert Fox himself, called them the unit that caused more damage than any other British force of equal strength, not because of what they destroyed, but because of what they made possible. The forgotten unit that made the SAS possible. Now you know their name.